Okay, and next up, Lisa is going to tell us how domain experts use an embedded DSL.
Great. Can people hear me okay? I tend to be really loud, so I don't want to okay, cool. Great. Okay, so hi, I'm Lisa Rennels. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. And today I'm going to present some work done jointly with Professor Sarah Chasins in the Plate Lab. I'm also, actually my home department is the Energy and Resources Group at Berkeley, so I work between that department working on climate change policy and the computer science department. So I wear a lot of hats, and this project was cool because I got to put both the hats on, which rarely happens. So yeah, hope you enjoy. So I'm going to talk about introduction and motivation, then research questions and methods, findings and design implications, and a quick conclusion. Bear with me on the first part. It'll be a little long just because I want to make sure I set things up properly. Some things will be familiar, but others might not be. So the beginning is probably familiar. Experts across a diverse range of fields have come to rely on programming and computation, and in particular, I've noticed this in the earth sciences and climate change communities. So there have been various efforts that I've seen at universities that I've been affiliated with or working with, including Berkeley, MIT, and the JuliaCon community, where this is becoming prevalent. So these applications for domain-specific languages and programming tools for the earth sciences community and the climate change community. That's both researchers, but also policymakers. And in these situations, the practitioners often lack formal computer science training, but share problem formulations and vocabulary. So I say formal here because especially with the newer generation, we're often seeing that everyone's using programming or using it as a tool, but they lack formal training. And this is a slightly different audience with different needs than maybe people that we're used to designing tools for. So domain-specific languages are a long-standing and popular strategy for meeting the needs of such domain experts, and this includes embedded DSLs, which is what I'll focus on today. A brief pause for terminology. So I'm going to use the terms developer or designer to talk about individuals designing and implementing languages, and then user or end user as the person using the language. This is a user study implementing some human-computer interaction methodologies. So user experience will be a broad term that I use to discuss many aspects of the programmer's interactions with languages. Usability, a more specific term about a programmer's ability to accomplish a particular goal. So briefly, the tool that I'm going to be talking about is called Mimi. This is a tool I've been working on for the past 6 years with my PhD advisor and a small team at UC Berkeley. It's a framework and platform to build a type of model called integrated assessment models. Happy to talk a lot about these with anyone who's interested, but for now, just know that they're a key type of model in the macroeconomic literature and policy-making communities that look at how climate change impacts the economy and then are used to underlie policy. Briefly, they matter, and this tool has actually been picked up, which has been a really great success. So one of our favorite things is the panel on the right shows that the list of models is now getting completely unwieldy for one PowerPoint slide. It didn't used to be this unwieldy, so that's really good. In the middle, you can see that a lot of universities throughout the United States and outside of the United States are starting to lean on this platform for academic research and publications, including our recent work in Nature. And we also collaborate quite a bit with agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and the state of New York. So this work is also underpinning regulatory analysis and policy analysis. And then here, just showing that it's also underpinning actual federal rulemaking that's happening. So this is a snapshot of the public GitHub of the EPA. And this tool is underlying the social cost of greenhouse gases work that is a proposed rule on the docket right now. So I'm just going to stay like a couple key pieces about Mimi, just so for some context, but I can also go into more later. One is that these models are mostly modular, so we use sort of this Lego approach. People's mental mapping of these models is often their components linked together. So you have the climate system as a component, you have several pieces of the macroeconomy or components, and these are linked together, doing equations, producing variables. These are parameters for other components. So we use sort of a vocabulary that evokes that. So we have components, we have parameters, we connect with parameters. So that's kind of like the general structure that you see on the left. Or I guess it's your right. We interact a bunch with the package management system of Julia. This becomes important for user experience. I won't go into that a lot, but it is in the paper. And a lot of these models are represented as packages themselves, which ended up having a lot of implications, unexpected implications for users. We depend heavily on custom types and multiple dispatch. This is a big feature in Julia. So for example, here, model is a custom type here, and then we create a method to extend Julia's base run function to run a model. So again, we're sort of embedding, using extending and using multiple dispatch. And finally, we're pretty macro heavy. I'm not going to talk about this a bunch in this particular talk, but I think it was an important finding that we had, the pros and cons, some of which are probably very familiar to folks. But we do use a lot of macros to define our types, such as components. All right, last motivation slide. Evidence suggests an opportunity for language designers to improve user experience via a better understanding of eDSL user needs. So while we noticed in the literature a lot of design tenets and a lot of descriptions about why embedding a domain-specific language as opposed to other implementation strategies is attractive for designers, but also that there seems to be a lack of usability. So for example, in this study, and I can go into this study later, but very broadly, the ranking for implementation effort on the part of the designer was #1, so designers seem to really like using embedding as an approach, but the ranking for an end user effort, which is a combination of quantitative and qualitative metrics in this paper, ranked nearly last. So this dichotomy seemed to present sort of an opportunity to understand a bit more about why this is happening and see if we can improve. So this will be brief. We designed our study around 2 primary research questions. The first is, what kinds of programming challenges do domain experts face during use of an eDSL designed for their domain? And the second is, which of these challenges arises specifically because the DSL is embedded or because of interactions between the DSL and the host? This latter part is partially because it's embedded, so there's interactions between a host. I'm not going to talk too much about the methods here, but I do want to emphasize that this was a user study with domain experts. So these are profiles of a few of the domain experts that we worked with for this study. They primarily came from non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, academia, and the federal government, all of them use programming in their day-to-day, but are not expert programmers by any means. Often we're picking up programming specifically for these tasks. And they do have a very common language and common experiences in the climate and economics domains. Okay, so I'm going to just talk about a few findings and design implications. I'd recommend you look at the paper if you're interested, because there are way more than I can describe here. But I'll describe a few findings meaning kind of the things we observe without trying to infer or speculate too much. And then design implications, the things that we think this might imply for language designers. We have 5 key categories of findings in the paper listed here. Impacts of host language, impacts of interactions between host and embedded language, engaging with eDSL-specific communities, engaging with eDSL-specific tutorials and code bases, and integrating multiple tools via the host language. And I'm just going to go into a few findings here. But in the paper, we try to frame this also as things that we find that sort of back up common tenets that we read about in the design literature, and also places where we actually find contrasting information, where we might want to rethink common tenets, especially in light of the idea of a new type of audience using these tools. So the first one is that we found some interesting results from blurring the line between the eDSL and the host language. So a lot of the common tenets, design tenets that we read basically say you should make the embedded domain-specific language blur with the host language such that the user doesn't really know which one they're using at any given time. This makes a lot of sense for an experienced user of a general programming language. They can bring along their intuition with debugging, their intuition with syntax to use the embedded language. And so I think there are a lot of advantages, but we also found a couple places where I think this actually introduced pain points, especially for novice users who are learning both the embedded language and the general purpose language at the same time, which was a bit surprising given the common advice. So I'll just do 2 cases. The first one here is where the integration was quite seamless. It seems minor, but this is actually really tough for new users, is trying to figure out where to look for help. So this is just an example where parameter is a custom MIME type. but the user thought it was a Julia type. So they're trying to use the Julia help REPL to search for information. They see that it's not defined. I think eventually they went and looked at the MIMI documentation, but this contrast of where to look for documentation created some confusion and also just curiosity. Folks kind of wanted to understand what was MIMI, what was Julia. The second example is a bit more convoluted. This is all happening within a macro, which is important. But this is kind of where we imperfectly integrated. So this first line, temperature equals parameter with arguments, this is again within a macro, so this is going to be used by our parsing logic to generate code that will then be executed at runtime. This user was using a Julia formatter. So the Julia formatter put a semicolon at the beginning of this argument list, because in Julia you can put a semicolon between your named and unnamed arguments. So we purposely made this look so much like a function in Julia that the formatter picked it up and added this semicolon. But we didn't write our parsing logic within the macro to handle that semicolon. Which sounds really minor, but you end up with this fairly ridiculous error message that the user cannot understand at all. Error messages is a whole other part of this paper. But this was a place where we kind of tried to be tricky and elegant and make it look like Julia code and actually kind of backfired on us. My advisor has a whole thing about how they shouldn't format within macros, so he and that guy are having a conversation apparently, but you know. He says it's a formatter problem, I think it's our language problem, but either way, this created some confusion. So just some design considerations. Again, there were a bunch of different findings in this general category. I just talked about one. And some of the things we concluded here, that it might be good to anticipate confusion for novice users and also expect some curiosity about distinctions. It might be good to pair documentation. And also sometimes explicit differentiation might be helpful. So even though it's a bit more clunky, a little less elegant, it might actually be helpful, especially for novice users. So two more kind of high-level findings. Some of these might sound familiar, but we still thought they were interesting. First, we found that users really wanted to engage with eDSL-specific communities. So we kind of combed forums. We saw very little question on Stack Overflow, on the Julia language discourse. It is a small user base, but still we found that basically all of them are engaging with the MIMI forum that we run or contacting us personally. Very few people are going to these general purpose language forums. They also reported that eDSL-specific support in these forums and seeing this community played a big role in adoption. So one user, for example, basically said that noticing that the research community was starting to use this tool at a workshop we ran was the main reason that he started using it. Because he's a PhD student, he's hoping to get involved with existing research, so he started using the tool. So implications for us here are that running this forum, even though it's a lot of work, is really valuable. And also hosting conference workshops and things to help bring the community together are really important aspects to designing this language. More broadly, it shows that perhaps eDSL designers don't get to just piggyback on the host language to use their forums and their documentation. We actually do have to kind of replicate it to create a community, which places extra burden on the designers and is an interesting kind of conversation, especially with open source software. And a final point is engaging with eDSL-specific tutorials and code bases. So one thing we noticed is that rather than starting new programs from scratch, participants tended to start from existing programs, either from other users or from the tutorials. So this is sort of that blank page syndrome. So we see here a model that already existed. This is a snapshot from a paper. This is a model that existed in the literature. And the authors of these papers used MIMI to add the blue section to the model. And this is a very common way that these models evolve in this literature. They sort of get like built onto each other and then new insights are gathered. Similarly, we saw engagement with eDSL-specific tutorials and code bases. So this is a case where I was lazy and it backfired. So I wrote this documentation, I'm writing a tutorial, and I decided to write this sort of everything but the kitchen sink tutorial. So I wrote this tutorial. It's basically a Monte Carlo simulation. I'm showing all these different ways that you can assign a distribution to a random variable. But this is not actually a program someone would want to use because I have a couple extra lines up here that don't end up getting used. So I assign a distribution to a random variable, but I never assign the random variable to an actual variable in the model. And this ended up confusing like 2 or 3 participants because they notice this, they don't understand why. Some of them figure out that it's useless code, some of them think they're doing something wrong. So the conclusion here is just to expect, basically, that users are going not to work from scratch, but work from each other's code or work from the code that you provide. One conclusion there is that we might be able to support this more by including eDSL features that allow users to build on each other's work, so we've been doing that. And also just to expect that this is going to happen, and that might have implications, for example, for how quickly we evolve the API, for how much attention we pay to the code that we kind of put out into the universe that people might build on, and also just kind of a humbling experience of realizing how much control or lack thereof we might have of the code that begins to get propagated and used. And the last thing is just that we speculate a bit about the connection to this particular domain. So climate change and climate economics are highly politicized, and just people are very worried about getting things right. So they tend to build on published work in incremental ways. And so more broadly, a conclusion there is just working on these domain-specific languages, paying a lot of attention to maybe the specific needs of that domain community would have helped us think a little bit more carefully about the implications. So that's all I have. Here's my email, or my email's number. Our website's up here, and the email is connected. Happy to answer questions. And I guess this is like the thing that people do too. I am also on the job market. So if people are interested, let me know. This is kind of interdisciplinary work that I don't know who has departments where it's interesting, but postdocs, anything, happy to chat. All right.
Hi, I'm Michael Koblenz, UC San Diego. Thanks for the talk and thanks for the work. So I've started talking to a variety of scientists about programming things. And what I hear from a lot of them is Python, 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 Fortran, Python, right? And so you're somebody who has designed something that has gotten adopted. And so I'm wondering what tips you have or what lessons you've learned about how to build things that they actually appreciate and use. You mentioned some community things. I'm wondering what else you can talk about.
Yeah, and sorry, did you say you were talking to a specific field of scientists? I just didn't hear.
A variety of some oceanographers, some climate change people, a variety of different kinds of people.
Scientists.
Yes, natural scientists, yeah.
Yeah, well, one thing maybe we can chat after. There's a really great paper by someone who did like an ethnographic study at a climate group at the UK that has like some really good information. Maybe you've seen it already. Yes. But yeah, I think that the community building has been really important and the outreach, and I think we also just had to be very patient and sow the seed. So I think one thing that really helped was we got it into use in the federal government, which can be hard, but we got an NSF grant that paired with them and then helped them start using it. And now that researchers are seeing that the policymakers that they want to work with are using it, you're seeing a lot of impetus there. So I think linking it to policy helps a lot.
Okay, you two definitely need to talk more afterwards. One more quick question.
Yeah, very short one. To embed the DSL was one of the design decisions made. Another would have been to add additional models and aggregate the languages then afterwards. Did you also look into this as one of the approaches that could have been helped for not blurring up the models and
you mean
confusing here?
Designing a brand new language? Is that the question?
And put it besides the existing language, the models.
Sorry, I don't know if I... So the question is, why did we decide to do an embedded language instead of build a brand new one? Yeah, good question. Wasn't my initial choice, so I should first ask my advisor. But I think that the high-level answer was the low effort. So this is not our primary work. At this point, we're not even funded to do it. It's like a project. So I think it was basically, my advisor's a Julia designer, and so we could piggyback on top, and that kind of allowed us to keep it going.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's thank the speaker.